This is something that there's a bit of debate about often from different coaches. But for me, I came from a swimming background, so it was often all about you've got to breathe to both sides. You've got to do it all the time. And I think there's some truth to it. But what I recommend to most of the adults that I coach these days is there's nothing wrong with breathing to the one side. And if it's every 2 strokes, especially in a race, then you're probably going to get a bit more air in. You can hold a faster effort. So don't breathe every 3 strokes just because someone told you to. It's an individual thing, and there's nothing wrong with breathing every 2. It's a great skill to have, to be able to breathe bilaterally. So in training, I think it is worthwhile doing at least some of your laps or your session to the opposite side, but it doesn't need to be the whole time. And there's no set breathing pattern either. So if you're in a 50-meter pool, don't feel like every breath needs to be on like 2 strokes or 3 strokes. You can mix it up. If you look at Ariana Titmus, so in her 400, she was breathing 2, 4, 2, 4, 2, 4. So she mixed it up within each lap. So there's no hard and fast rules. I think it's good to find a pattern and then stick to it for that event or that set that you're doing. At the start, sometimes it's good to just bring some awareness to what you're doing if you've never thought about it. And one of the mistakes that people often make is they exhale from their mouth, and the majority of it should come from your nose. We find that your heart rate can be a little bit more controlled, a little bit lower when you do exhale from your nose. And the way that you see most top freestylers doing it is after they get that inhale, they'll exhale really lightly. So some bubbles will leave the nose, sometimes the mouth as well. But then as they turn their face to the side, it's a big exhale through the nose. That's when they clear their lungs. So for the most part, the majority of that exhale will come as you turn your head to the side. But make sure it's primarily from the nose. And we've had I put out a video about 2 years ago just about that one tip. And the amount of comments under that video about people who were exhaling from the mouth and they changed it, and then they could swim double what they were before. They might have been only able to swim 50 meters, but they were able to go to 100 or 200. There was a huge amount of response to that. And so to me, that just showed it's a problem that doesn't get talked about enough.
We know that the thing that loads bone the most is not hitting the ground, it's the muscle contractions. So we're not looking at having someone land heavily. We're having them to try and push off as quick as possible. So you want to look at power activity, so plyometrics, jumping and those sorts of things. And you can land softly, that's fine. But what you want to do is try and push off as hard as you can and jump as high as you can. And then land pretty softly. So it's the muscle that is the primary loader of the bone. And you don't need to do a lot. Like we said, 100 back-to-back cycles. If you're doing jumping, you're not going to get up to 100 cycles unless you're doing skip rope or something like that. But yeah, doing some counter movement jumps, multi-directional sorts of things, playing a little bit of basketball in the driveway, or doing something, kicking the ball around with kids, soccer ball and things like that. When you start introducing these sorts of things, though, you have to remember that these activities are introducing bone load. And so you've got to think about your running workload, that if you are going to start introducing plyometrics and other things, you need to drop down your running workload a little bit first, because this is going to be superimposed on what you're doing running-wise. So drop your workload a little bit, start introducing plyometrics. It might be once a day. You might have a plyometric session once a week to start with. Or you might start and then progress it to being more regular, but drop your workload or your mileage or whatever, kilometers, introduce the plyometric bone loading side of things. And then as you're tolerating that, then you increase your running workload back up again. You're just hitting those bone cells all together. So you want to do it, 4 to 6 hours after run. You might run in the morning, and then you want to do your plyometrics 4 hours later, once those bone cells become responsive again. If you do it immediately after running, you're basically wasting your time because the bone cells are deaf and you're just loading your skeleton. So it's not working. So do it after a few hours, after you've finished loading the skeleton, But you can do it daily. It's just a matter of building up your tolerance to that and not say, okay, I'm currently doing 70 miles, 100K a week. I'm going to do plyometrics daily now. And you just throw that on top of your current mileage. So you want to think about, okay, I'm going to do this 3 times this week. I'm going to drop my mileage a little bit. I'm going to do some plyometrics Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or whenever. Do it for 3 days a week, increase your mileage back up. And then if you think, okay, I want to start doing this daily, you're going to have to drop your mileage a little bit more again, and then start doing it daily, and then build your mileage up again.
I've come up with this concept of rider independent, runner dependent. So it comes down to the measurement devices. So in cycling, you have a strain gauge, which is going to measure force or torque. So power is torque times angular velocity. Just quickly, a little background on your cycling power meter. What it does is measures the amount of force you're producing through the pedals, and that wherever your strain gauge is, rear hub, spider, crank, pedal, and then it's measuring how fast you're pedaling, and that's the angular velocity, and then that's work over time. And so you're getting your power number. Now, Brad, you and I, you've just got your new specialized shiv, whatever you're using, right? And you're like, man, this thing is fast. And I'm like, oh man, this is pretty cool. All right, so let's see who can do the best 1 minute power. We'll just have a go. You jump on your bike, go all out 1 minute. My turn, go all out 1 minute. Now, we got the readings, 450 versus 440. You win. Damn. But it's directly comparable. That bike was just measuring that strain gauge within that crank, measured how much force you put out and how fast you're pedaling, and it, in order to overcome wind resistance and whatever. That was your number. That was my number. Same strain gauge, everything. Now, when we have the foot pod or the wrist-based heart rate, whatever it is, if we want to do the same thing, right? Okay, who's got the best 1K power? I'll go, and then if I
and this is for running, Will, now. Just to
yep. Sorry. Yep.
So we've done the bike test. 1 minute all out efforts.
Yeah.
Now we're at the shoes on, and we're going out for a 1K all out effort.
Yeah. Yep. So on the bike, yep, we both just used your bike to see who could get the best 1 minute peak power, right? And now we're going on the run, and we want to see peak power, right, for 1K. I go. Now, when I pass over let's say my watch and my foot pod, because they're all synced, and I'm like, yeah, your turn. You're going to go do your 1K, but now your numbers are not comparable with mine, because I've had to input my height and my weight. So where this power number, if we go back to the start, where it's force equals mass times acceleration, now, because we don't have a direct measurement like a strain gauge measuring force, we have a calculator, like an algorithm that is going, okay, look, Will, you weigh 75 kgs and you spend this long on the ground contact, you spend this amount of time in the air, and you travel this far. That's this amount of energy, okay? And you're traveling this fast velocity, so that's that amount of power. If I give this over to you, you're not as tall as me, and you're maybe not as heavy as me. So for you to run 3 minute Ks, it's going to say, okay, well, you're 75 kgs, but you're actually not. Let's just say you're 60 kgs. So now you're like, your power number's wrong for you, where it was right for me. And so we're on the bike, there's that direct measurement, that strain gauge. So that's rider independent. It doesn't care who you are. It just cares, that strain gauge just cares how much force is being produced. Whereas your wristwatch, your GPS, whatever, the foot pod, it needs to know who you are. It needs to know how tall you are and how heavy you are, because to, run a certain speed, produce a certain amount of force, is correlated to those those two inputs, those two variables, and that's where the big difference is. Okay, and so then that can be because of the nature of the algorithm and also your weight. Those numbers could be wildly different or they could be super similar, but the way in which you get to that number, that power number, is very different. So you can't say, yep, 250 on the bike, 250 on the run.
I think from kind of looking at some of the injury epidemiology studies, one of the tough things about getting that data just on middle distance runners alone is in some of these studies, middle distance and long distance runners are grouped together. So you're probably not always getting the same picture or the right picture of what types of injuries are we seeing out of these runners, but we can kind of think about the traditional running injuries where most of them that we see are from the knee down. That's kind of in place as a framework. And then we have these athletes that do also need to be hitting faster top speeds at relatively high frequencies per week. So then almost kind of phasing in some of the injuries that we see more commonly in sprinting, like your hamstring strains, rect fem strains, calf strains, and that kind of makes up then the bulk of what you'd see in middle distance running. So most things from about the knee down, the lower leg, some bone stress injuries in those areas, and then some of your high-speed running related injuries like hamstring and calf strains. To me, the implications then from a rehab standpoint go towards what are those things that we do from rehabbing the injury, and then what are those things that we do from an injury prevention standpoint. Very, very popular to use things like the Nordic hamstring or heavy loaded eccentric exercise for the prevention of some of these acute muscle strain injuries. And from a rehab side of things, some of them are tough because we have to restore a certain amount of running volume before it's built up the cumulative tolerance to get to a certain level of running intensity. And then when you are talking about the different subgroups of what type of middle distance runner is this, that's when you might go one way versus the other from a rehabilitation standpoint in terms of what type of training load to restore, what to put your first priority in before getting to the next thing.
Number one cause of a bone stress injury is doing too much too soon. So our bones are phenomenal in that they do adapt to the loads we put on them by becoming either stronger if you're overloading them or weaker. If you go into microgravity into space, you lose bone like crazy, or if you're bedridden or have a cast on the limb, you lose bone. But if we're trying to build bone, we overload them, and our bones can adapt to that and adapt beautifully, not just in mass, but in shape. But the trouble is it takes a while for that to happen. So if you begin a training program and you go from being a couch potato to suddenly running 10Ks every couple of days, you are a bone stress injury waiting to happen.
We were gobsmacked when we first came out with the products. We looked at the science and thought, well, if we're recommending, broadly speaking, if we're recommending increments of 30, 60, 90, 120 grams of carbohydrate, we started reading the packets of different sports nutrition products, and they've all got seemingly random amounts of carbs in them. Like a gel could be anything. We found one energy gel that was quite a high volume, which only had 17 grams of carbs in it. And we found another one which had 26 grams or 28 grams. And then and it was the same with drinks and this. So in the end, what we said was, do you know what's a real performance advantage here is just putting 30 grams of carb in every unit of our products. And then people can just do that maths on the fly. It's just like, I need one of these an hour. I need two. I need three. I need four, whatever it is, you can mix and match. And as you say, that's been one of the fundamentals for one of the best bits of feedback we've had from a lot of athletes is that it just takes that not that it's a huge cognitive load, but it's just reassuringly easy to think, oh yeah, no, I've had 3 of those. I've had 90 grams, job done. Move on to thinking about something more important. It also makes that process, actually, when we work with athletes who are using our products predominantly, it makes that debrief process after an event really easy, because we can just say to Sam, how many joules do you have on the bike, Sam? Oh, I had 2 joules an hour. Okay, great. That's 60 grams. There's no, there's no kind of working out. There's no getting your calculator out.
Well, first to the injury, I think that's one of the reasons that why we have had no injuries is because we are very, careful about the intensity, or making sure that the intensity is correct on all the sessions. And one of the key metrics we use for that is actually lactate. So lactate concentration or lactate production, depending on what kind of session we are doing, is something that I closely monitor. Because it tells also where the really nice thing with lactate is that it actually tells how much energy that comes from the glycolysis. You're measuring indirectly into the glycolysis. So for the importance of having a sports scientist in there, I think one of the successes we've had is that the difficulty, if you have like somebody that is separate or has an individual role in the lab, so he does the lab testing and then he tries to bring it over to, let's say, a coach, and then a coach tries to make sense out of that and try to interpret it and bring that over to an athlete again. I think you're losing quite a lot on the way. That's one, and also it's not sure that even the coach is really understanding the whole or all the things or why things are. The research in the lab, he doesn't know the context that the athlete comes into the lab with, or who he is, what he. So I think there are so many things lost in translation there. That one of the key strengths maybe that we have had is that I'm both running the lab, testing and all these kind of things, but I'm also the scientist that are interpreting it and putting it into a bigger context. And at the same time, I'm also in the field coaching the athletes and doing the measurements on them. So I know, for example, for me, when I see the number on the lactate meter, for me, it's not a number. For me, it's something that goes into a context of what have Christian done the day before? What is actually the session today? How important is it? What is the session tomorrow or the next days? That's for one. And so also on top of that, I know what is the stimuli that Christian needs. So, for example, now if Christian goes and I see that he is going a little bit harder than maybe he should, but at the same time, so he would, but I know that this is actually what he needs. And today he feels fresh, so he is reporting that he really feels strong, he feels good. Then I would say, okay, fine. Then we use that. Then we shift a little bit the focus of the session towards that. That's the stimuli that he gets it, because today is the day, because it matches with his feeling and ability to maybe progress even. So it's not a fixed tool that just says, oh, this is the concentration. Oh, you have to go lower, you have to go faster, because it's in a bigger context of what's the program and what's the stimuli that Christian, Gustav, Kasper, and so on needs and that dictates a little bit what my next, or let's say what words I would choose when communicating that to Christian, when I see, okay, this is the number. Okay, let's go, let's continue. Or I say, okay, maybe slow down a little bit, because tomorrow we have a more important session and you're already a little bit high. It's not important that important to push it today on this session or something like this. So it is always in a context,
We look at the observational data we have, when someone has persistent patellofemoral pain, generally over time, their activity level will decrease. They either have to change track and involve themselves in activities that they don't necessarily truly enjoy, or they cease or dramatically reduce activity on the whole. So if we think about consequences there for public health in terms of metabolic health, cardiovascular health, body mass, all of these variables that this awful pandemic that we've experienced has kind of really shone a light on. If you have PFP, you're more likely to have poor general physical health. And then the other answer would be psychological status or health-related quality of life. If we look at some of the large cohort studies we have, and there was a really nice systematic review from a few years ago, led by Liam McLaughlin, who did a PhD up at UQ in your neck of the woods with Bill Vincenzino. Rates of anxiety, depression, kinesiophobia, etc. Much higher in people with PFP compared to the general population. Now, unlikely to be any higher in PFP than other persistent musculoskeletal conditions like low back pain, for example. But the reality is that the health burden of persistent PFP, both physical and non-physical, is there for all to see, really.
And even down to things like career choices and participation, I've read in various for adolescents in their various future endeavors, it can alter that. People ruling themselves out of certain careers because they know that they'll get pain squatting down or going downstairs.
Significantly so. If we and lean on the military data, if 43% is a genuine figure, that's almost half of every recruit that goes through basic training that's probably going to withdraw from their military career, isn't it? And adolescence is another perfect example. That was one of the things that really struck me from completing that systematic review. The incidence or the mean incidence, the average of all the studies, is as high in military recruits as it is in adolescents, and so someone with 2 young kids that I'd like to hope will go on and enjoy lots of sports and continue to be sporty and active for the entirety of their lives. It's a genuine burden in adults and adolescents alike.
When you're running and you are about to transition from pavement to grass, sometimes that happens on a run, or you just want to cross the street and go across the mean. A couple of things happen. I think often grass fools us because there's grass, but you don't really know what the surface is like. Right? So often we sort of innately and innately stiffen up to minimize the degrees of possible movements that occur at each joint. And that might be a protective mechanism. I honestly couldn't really tell you the sort of neurological processes involved here. It certainly seems like a protective mechanism to minimize the degrees of freedom or the possible movements that are allowable through our joints by stiffening.